Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final event of today, the roundtable talk on thinking about the EU in federal terms. My name's Thorlakson. I'm from the University of Alberta, and I am delighted to be here with two esteemed colleagues, Erik Fossum from the University of Oslo and Jenson here from the University of Montreal. And this question, it's the inescapable question, really. All roads lead to Rome, and any discussion that we've been having today always comes back to this question of whether there is analytical utility in thinking about the EU in federal terms. Maybe normatively, should the EU be a federal system? And there are many layers to this question. And I think we have two panelists here who are quite nicely balanced, because we have Erik, who has spent quite a lot of his time thinking about federalism and thinking about the European Union in terms of democracy and representation. And we have Jane, who has spent a lot of time thinking about issues of federalism in terms of social policy. And I think that this difference of perspective is going to bring some very important perspectives here to this discussion. So we will begin with Erik, followed by Jane. We're going to keep this nice and short and sweet for you, because we hope that it will then swiftly lead into some discussion and mingling afterward.
Thank you very much, Laurie. I would like to start by making some methodological observations about comparison and comparability. Now, when we just raising the question of EU is in itself a comparison, because we implicitly compare in anything we do. When we say something is unique, we have already compared. So that comparison is an approach we take to thinking, basically. And I'm a big fan of Charles Tilly, and he talked about comparison not simply as a method, but as a strategy. And he uses several types of approaches. One is individualizing. That would be focusing on the EU as unique. And again, from where would it be unique? Well, okay, the federal reference point would be one reference point in order to single out to what extent the EU stands out and distinct from other kind of federal states. That would be, so we have had this individualizing approach today being discussed. You also have a universalizing approach, saying that, well, if the EU is a case of state formation or so on, you expect this to go through certain types of phases or stages or whatever, and then you were looking for uniform patterns. Then you have the standard notion that is variation finding, to look at similarities and differences. And the last one is the one that Rockham was using, that's encompassing. That is, you have an idea of a system and you look at each individual entity in relation to that. Now, you can take all these and look at the current situation, and each of them will give you some angle on discussing the EU also from a federal perspective. You will come up with different answers, also depending on the type of questions you ask. But anyway, my plea is that there is mileage to be had by thinking about comparison in relation to this. One doesn't have to end up with a conclusion saying that it qualifies anything like this, but it's definitely a necessary and a useful approach to use comparison to the EU. But one has to be careful with how, because it depends on the question you ask, what kind of approach to comparison you would be using. Now, and then let me say something about the EU. First, a few things about the present, and then a little bit about what I think is a desired outcome, namely to try to make it into a democratic federation. Now, my point of the party is that I don't think the EU in its current situation is sustainable in the long run. This is a very negative notion, but I'm actually very concerned. I mean, you see Italy now, the situation and so on. We're talking about a very precarious situation and a very precarious system. So I'd be delighted if somebody can convince me that this is not the case, but I am, as of now, I am not convinced that in its current situation it is actually going to be able to survive, at least in a meaningful way. Of course it can continue to be there and so on, but to have a meaningful central role that we all expect from it. I think something needs to be done. the other thing is that the EU is exceptionally diverse. When we talked about asymmetrical federations, and Louis gave us a very nice and good overview of Canada. However, the EU doesn't start there. The EU starts from diversity, because each state is different in the EU. Federations are, structurally speaking, more or less similar, with some deviations. The EU is off the scale, because it is so different. And with the enlargements, it has imported even more diversity. And part of that diversity is spun into the integration process that feeds back into the states again. So you have these kinds of circles and particular types of loops in the EU. So this diversity aspect of dealing in the EU is different. So we talk about differentiation and so on. Yes, of course, it is the essence of what the EU is. So integration, to some extent, is an attempt to limit this type of diversity. It is not the idea of homogenization or anything like this, but as you can also see with directives, the EU is flexible, and it is allowing for some variation because it is fully aware of the fact that there's so much difference and diversity in Europe. Now, I think the EU has also a federal kind of structure, but it's a distinctive form, what I would call a multi-headed federation, which actually has affinities with Canada. Because there is no constitutional agreement on Canada, the First Minister's Council also operates as a constitutional body in Canada. So the difference, of course, is that in Canada you have a fully fledged federal government with all the paraphernalia and a constitutional arrangement and so on that is contested but within bounds. In the EU, of course, the European Council is operating in relation to the EU institutions, but they are much weaker than the Canadian and they don't have the resources. And yet, at the same time, what is important and actually is common to the two is that it is a political body that is the fundamental balancer of competences or divisions between levels in the EU and in Canada. The European Council plays that role as second-order constitution maker in the European Union. So it is actually performing the function of balancing. What is distinctive about actually both Canada and the EU, but even more so with the EU, is that it is on the one hand about fundamental constitutional issues, it's about political issues, and it is about very minute issues of substance. And there is no clear differentiation and prioritization between these, so that it can be taken off whenever there's a treaty or intergovernmental conference. It can be spun off into something else because of caprice, because of circumstance. So it cannot keep its eyes focused on the constitutional fundamentals of this. It's one of the things. But so to keep its focus on this as being a genuine federal balancer is impossible for this. And that's one of the limitations and defects and problems of the EU in this sense. But it's a political body because you don't have legal agreement on the fundamentals of the Constitution. So now there's a signal, so I have much more limited time. But I mean, the fundamental is that in established federations, you have the Constitution and the courts are actually policing the borders and so on. In those contested situations, you have political bodies, doing this. Now, if the EU is going to go into becoming a full-fledged federation, what I think is necessary is two things. One is to roll back the EU's remit of action. Because the EU, through the Single European Act, which is, by the way, very much a UK element that it injected in, it's a virus in my mind, a Thatcherite virus that was injected in the EU through the Single European Act and mutual recognition, has meant, also because of the Court of Justice's actions and the Four Freedoms, has meant that the EU is becoming an ever-presence in all kinds of areas of life, but with a very limited range of policy instruments and not resources commensurate to deal with these issues. And therefore you get a lopsided system, both in terms of levels and in terms of socioeconomics. It is off kilter on both counts in the current situation. It's problematic. So that on the one hand, the EU should be rolled back in certain functions, and at the same time, the EU institutions should be consolidated with own resources and a full actual fiscal means to stabilize the institutions and the system in place. That means that there has to be a choice made for those states that want to be part of this. And I proposed a Penelope solution that was introduced with the Constitutional Treaty, that those states that agree sign on. And those that don't, they can live with Norway. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so the question that Johannes gave us was, should the EU be analyzed as a federal system? And the easiest answer, and maybe the one you want to hear, is no. It's not a state, it lacks a stable and a constitutional division of powers. It remains sui generis, a supranational institution. But it's not so polite when you're invited to come to reject the host's question out of hand and say, let's go drink and eat. So I've tried to answer the question that was asked, should the EU be analyzed as a federal system? Now, to begin with, I want to emphasize that and after the end of the day, we still don't know what federalism is. Even Louis Massacotte, my expert on institutions, included Spain and the UK in his list of federations, and I said, really? So that the definitional problem of what is federalism, and this is an endemic problem. I want to insist on this. This has been present since for the last 70 years at least of discussions of federalism, is that we don't quite know what it is. And this raises a classic dilemma of comparative politics. And I want to talk a bit about this dilemma of comparative politics, or of comparison. Now, Erik gave a very eloquent presentation of Tilly. I have a much more simple version of the comparative politics issue, which is, can we compare apples and oranges? That's how I learned the question. And so we could rephrase the question that was assigned to us as, is the EU a federal apple, or is it an orange? Or maybe it's a passion fruit, too different from any apple or even any orange to merit comparison. And we learned in comparative politics that the way of resolving this question was to move up a level of generality and say, but of course we can compare because they are all fruit. But I want to question whether this is a solution for the EU. And even if you say they're all fruit, you fall back to the definitional problem of what is a federal system. And then to the question of what is being compared. Are we comparing, and here there was confusion today, this isn't a criticism, it's just a comment, that because it's also there in the literature, are we comparing institutions? Are we comparing modes of governance? Are we comparing legitimacy? What is it that we're comparing? And as anyone who's done comparative analysis knows, in order to do any comparison, you have to have a definition of the object of analysis. Now, the definitions of federalism, this is like a sinkhole. I went back to prepare for this to read one of the classic books in Canadian federalism, Garth Stevenson's book, Unfulfilled Union. The 5th edition was published in, I think, 2016. And he's still reviewing, and correctly so, the debates about definitions of federalism. So it hasn't been settled since I was a student and Garth was a student at the same time. Now, in institutional comparisons, there's a huge amount of variation. When I was a student, we spent a lot of time worrying about whether Canada was a federation because it was called a confederation. That was how it named itself, but also because it had all of these other things in the Constitution which allowed the central government to interfere with the provinces. So we worried a lot about whether it was a federation. I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to accept that Canada is a federation, and I'm going to adopt Garth Stevenson's definition from Unfulfilled Union, which is similar to what Johannes did, just take up a definition. So here's the definition. All functions are duplicated on the same territory. Executive, legislative, judicial. Neither level can abolish the other, and governance relationship in domains of overlap and encounter is one of bargaining. So I want you to remember those three. It's the same territory, you can't eliminate anybody, and the governance, you deal with overlap by bargaining. Now, certainly the EU confirms to the second and the third. I think we agree that there's a lot of bargaining, and neither the EU nor the member states can get rid of the other. But that where the EU isn't standard classic federalism or a federation is that it doesn't meet number one. Why? Because it depends on the member states for legislating, for transposing. It depends on the member states for enforcement through national courts and police, even if the Court of Justice can rule. It depends on the national states for respecting European positions, and here I'll just mention the Stability and Growth Pact and the absence of respect. But a second thing has been going on recently, and this is where my area of social policy comes in, is the EU has been backing away from legislation, backing away from directives in many cases, and turning to other methods of in monitoring, recommending, inducing, inciting. So that we see that it's hard to say that it's a real in quotation marks, federal system, because it overwhelmingly operates by bargaining. However, I want to get rid of this by saying that the whole question of if it's real or not is a time waster. Okay? This has been for years. Canada, I think, is a federation despite being a confederation. And the comparison depends on where you look. And I think, and this would be a message that I would give to the group, that I think it would be really useful to lower the level of analysis and to look more at sectors than at the big questions like democracy, and to see how the EU and the member states actually relate in sectoral relationships. To do something like Erik was talking about in intergovernmental relations, because a lot of Canadian federalism actually happens in intergovernmental relations, where you have other institutions that carry the negotiations and produce the outcomes. I want to end, though, by saying that there's other ways to make the comparisons, and whether the EU should be compared, should be analyzed as a federal system. There's a really long tradition, and we heard some of it today, about thinking about federalism as a federal society. This is the Livingston's position. It's a territorial grouping in which there's recognition on the basis of ethnic, religious, linguistic, whatever, recognition of diversity or recognition of difference, as we say here. And the EU fits into this category of a set of institutions or a political system that's trying to grapple with the recognition of difference. That, unfortunately, that literature tends to be teleological. There's an expectation that living together successfully will generate greater integration, greater sense of commonness, and that this will generate a feeling of legitimacy about federalism. Now, in this version, the comparison is actually a comparison of the level of legitimacy of the idea of divided or shared sovereignty. It's not a comparison of the institutions, it's a comparison of the commitments to or the legitimacy of the notion of federalism. And a lot of this underpins the federal dream of the early federalists and the current federalists, whether they're Europeans or Europeanists. The research question in this literature is a question about the legitimacy of the system itself. And in Canada, as we know, there have been questions about the legitimacy related to the sovereignty movement. But if you put that aside, there's a very relatively high or very high level of acceptance that the regime is federal. And it's the federalism that makes the politics. Now, I was going to tell my joke about the elephant, but I don't have time. If anyone asks me, I'll tell you the joke about the elephant. But I want to end by saying that it seems to me that it's in this area of the legitimacy of the notion of federalism that the real challenges to the contemporary challenges to the EU exist. In fact, it's not going forward, but it seems to me to be going backwards, or at least stuck. There's lack of legitimacy both at the elite level and at the level of the voters. We've heard this from Laurie. We've heard it from from Hartmut today. We've heard about democratic deficit, a growing opposition from populists. We're familiar with the vilification of Brussels and the use of blame avoidance or blame displacement by member states. There's the non-participation of voters. There's mobilization of exit as a partisan strategy, even within the parliament, as Laurie told us. Disregard of basic principles around the behavior of Poland. So that, in this sense, my conclusion by looking at this definition of federalism, at the ideational and the cultural acceptance, is that that's where the lack of correspondence between real, in quotation marks, federalism and the EU is, because in that sense the EU is likely to remain a passion fruit, inciting great deal, I'm playing on the metaphor, inciting a great deal of passion among some people and a great deal of dislike among others. And so that calling it a fruit, to do the comparison, may be an interesting political stance, maybe a necessary political stance, but is probably not a very useful analytic stance for political science. However, and this is where I want to end, it seems to me that being sui generis and analyzing it as sui generis is a totally honorable strategy. And I'm not sure why that kind of comparison, or what Erik calls individualizing, wouldn't be a totally useful form of comparison.